Thank you all for coming. Good evening. Welcome back to the Hilltop and the Center for Presidential History. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and that is particularly exciting tonight on an evening when we are going to be listening to a familiar face, but more on that in a moment. A couple of brief announcements. First, I want to note that we have some wonderful sponsors actually for this event. The Rhapsody Theater was very nice to wish to commemorate Ryan White by sending us these nice flowers for the event. And also we have sponsorship for this program from the Women and Gender Studies program here at SMU. Thank you to them. And also to the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute. Wonderful to have friends on campus. Now, quick thing for everyone to pop in the back of their mind, if you would. If you know a K through 12 teacher, and I bet you do, please remind them that we are doing a wonderful, I think it's going to be wonderful, prospectively wonderful, teacher seminar this summer, actually, and then the next 2 summers after that. This summer is going to be focused on the American Revolution, then next summer this summer is on the Declaration of Independence. I got to get my chronological order. Declaration of Independence comes before we say the Revolution, even though the Revolution was already ongoing. Don't go there. And then the Constitution, which I know comes last. So that's the 3rd week. So if you know of any teachers who want to participate in this program, please let us know. We'd really love to favor North Texas teachers in particular. And I think that it's something that really demonstrates a lot of the enthusiasm that's going on the Hilltop with our new leadership across the campus, which is, to my great joy, they want to prioritize us. The big us, like people who talk about things. The kind of people who say, before we build AI, maybe we should think if it's a good idea. So people who are interested in values and people who are interested in history and people who are interested in leadership. So next time you see a university administrator, give them a pat on the back and say, we like thinking. There you go. Okay. So, speaking of thoughtful people, I am really enthused tonight to have a success story for us. One of our postdocs from, I won't embarrass us both by saying how long ago, but Paul Renfro is, for now, an associate professor at Florida State University. I say for now because it's entirely possible by the time this evening is over, he will receive the official confirmation of his promotion to full professor. Yay. Because I wasn't feeling old enough to know that our postdocs are getting tenure. Now they're becoming full. But Paul is a great demonstration, I think, of just how successful and powerful our postdoctoral program has been. You have probably heard, and you've heard me say before, that the academic job market doesn't exist, which is why it's even all the more impressive that our people are getting jobs. If there is a job, we get them. So we've had some wonderful success over the last couple of years. I know it's going to continue along this year, and I'm entirely confident in the future. So if you are looking for a place to support your local postdoctoral fellow, this is the place. In any event, back to Paul, who again, success story. He is the associate professor so far promotable of history. He is the author of 2 books, Stranger Danger, Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State, which Oxford University Press published in 2020, and also The Life of Death of Ryan White, which my graduate students just read in class this last week. Had a fabulous discussion because, as you'll see, it's a fabulous topic and a wonderful book. And I'll remind you ahead of time that there are, of course, copies of the book to purchase once you see how just brilliant it is. He's also the co-editor of Growing Up America, Youth and Politics since 1945, which was brought out by the University of Georgia Press. And one of the fun things about doing a little web searching on people and thinking, what could I possibly say to introduce them that would be a little different, is sometimes you find something. So we'll get to it. Paul has published in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The New Republic, Slate, Dissent, The Jacobin, and here's the best one, so I'm so impressed, according to your own website, Teen Vogue. So you know he's an expert now. If you wouldn't mind, join me in welcoming Paul to the stage.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you all for being here. I'm really thrilled to be back at SMU. Special thanks go to Ronna Spitz, Jeff Engel, Brian Franklin, Jill Kelly, Susie Penman, and all the other wonderful folks with whom I've met thus far. I also want to acknowledge the Rhapsody Theater, the Women's and Gender Studies program at SMU, and the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute for co-sponsoring tonight's event. As Jeff mentioned, I served as a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Presidential History from 2016 to 2018, and just to kind of echo what he said, I'd be remiss if I didn't underscore just how formative and meaningful that postdoc was for my career. It enabled me to focus on revising my book manuscript and ultimately securing an advanced contract with Oxford. And the postdoc provided tremendous security and stability as I navigated the treacherous academic job market and eventually landed at Florida State. So thank you again to Jeff and Brian and everybody at CPH for seeing the promise in my work and for helping me become the scholar and the person I am today. Without further ado, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, after which I'll gladly answer any questions you might have. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. In a 1993 interview with Playboy magazine, the playwright, activist, and AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, co-founder Larry Kramer expressed his admiration for Ryan White. I think little Ryan White probably did more to change the face of this illness and to move people than anyone, declared Kramer. Ryan was courageous by confronting the issue and saying, in your face, here I am, and here AIDS is. I am the face of AIDS. How did a skinny teenage boy with hemophilia from a small city in Indiana become the most recognizable person with AIDS in the United States, if not the world? And how did he become the namesake of the Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency, or CARE Act, which delivered much-needed federal funding for HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment beginning in 1990? The answer, in a word, is innocence. Ryan White became a household name in 1985 after he was barred from attending his middle school on account of his illness. Because Ryan White had acquired HIV through contaminated blood products, and thus, quote, through no fault of his own, as many observers put it, he differed significantly from the populations most intimately associated with HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and beyond, namely men who had sex with men and people who used intravenous drugs. Ryan therefore emerged as the seemingly unassailable face of AIDS, in Kramer's words, a white, middle-class, sexually non-threatening Midwestern teenager, and a curious kind of celebrity. The virus now known as HIV has lived in human bodies since at least the early 20th century. Researchers have pinpointed 1920s Kinshasa in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a key site in the early transmission of HIV. It stands to reason then that HIV and AIDS probably appeared on the North American continent before the late 1960s. Still, scientists identify Robert Rayford as the first person to die of AIDS-related causes in the United States in the year 1969. A black teenager who never left his hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, Rayford may have contracted HIV while performing sex work, or he may have been sexually assaulted by someone carrying the virus. When Rayford died on May 16, 1969, the pathologist who performed his autopsy discovered a set of purplish lesions denoting Kaposi's sarcoma, or KS, a rare form of cancer that would become closely tied to AIDS in the 1980s. Injection drug users in the U.S. began contracting HIV during the mid to late 1970s. In New York City, the pervasive intravenous use of heroin and cocaine led to the rapid spread of HIV in the late 1970s and 1980s. Restrictions on access to sterile needles and other injection equipment exacerbated the crisis, which remains the largest HIV outbreak in injecting drug users in human history. In response to this epidemic, IV drug users in New York City adopted safer injection practices, reducing syringe sharing and increasing the availability and use of sterile injection equipment. With the legalization of needle exchange programs in the early 1990s, the New York State Department of Health, in conjunction with activists and the New York City government, began funding and issuing licenses for such programs. These measures helped dramatically curb the spread of HIV among people who injected drugs. Nevertheless, in the 70s, IV drug users garnered little sympathy from the public, as their deaths were often dismissively blamed on the, quote, junkie flu or the dwindles. It wasn't until 1981 that the virus, now known as HIV, entered the American public consciousness. At that moment, Americans learned about a series of Kaposi sarcoma cases affecting young gay men in Los Angeles and New York City. And it wasn't until 1985 that the media and political class found a poster boy for the epidemic. That poster boy was Ryan White. Jeannie White had been in labor for nearly 23 hours at Kokomo's St. Joseph Memorial Hospital before she finally gave birth to her son on December 6, 1971. But even after she delivered Ryan, named for actor Ryan O'Neal, the pain didn't stop, she later recalled. I felt like I was still in labor. She bled profusely and lost consciousness. Doctors sent helicopters all over Indiana to bring back Rh-negative blood for her, some 13 pints of blood overall. Jeannie White's experience mirrored that of her newborn son, who bled incessantly following his circumcision. Ryan was subsequently transported to Memorial Hospital in Indianapolis, where a hematologist diagnosed him with classic or severe hemophilia. Hemophilia is a rare, often inherited bleeding disorder that prevents the efficient clotting of blood, meaning people with hemophilia bleed excessively and sometimes unexpectedly. They also bruise easily and frequently experience pain and swelling in their joints. Hemophilia remained a dismal, painful, and highly lethal disease well into the 20th century. By the end of the Second World War, however, blood and plasma transfusions had become routine and relatively safe, as scholar Susan Resnick writes. And coagulation research undertaken during this period led to the use of cryoprecipitate, a cold precipitate of plasma that contained a high concentration of clotting material as a treatment for bleeding episodes. The emergence of cryoprecipitate helped inaugurate a so-called golden era for hemophilia research and treatment, paving the way for the development of easily accessible concentrates. These treatments, such as factor VIII, could be administered at home or on the go, so those with hemophilia could avoid onerous trips to the hospital in the event of a bleeding episode. Ryan White was born in this golden era for research and treatment. But as liberating as factor VIII and other self-administered treatments may have been for people with hemophilia in this moment, some proved riskier than others, even before the eruption of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s. Factor VIII and other concentrates pooled blood and plasma from thousands of donors. Each injection therefore introduced the blood cells of thousands of people into a user's body. By 1983, over 80% of people with severe hemophilia who had been treated with concentrate showed, quote, serologic evidence of previous exposure to hepatitis B antigen, although many, quote, considered the risk of hepatitis to be an acceptable price to pay for the benefits of AHF concentrate. Ryan White tested positive for hepatitis B in November 1984, just before his AIDS diagnosis. As HIV spread in the early 1980s, before the pervasive use of heat treatment to eliminate HIV in the blood supply, factor VIII represented both a lifeline and a potential death sentence for those with hemophilia. Ryan started to feel chronically ill in the summer of 1984. By the time he turned 13, on December 6th of that year, he had reached a breaking point. His mother, Jeannie, took him to the hospital in Kokomo, where an x-ray revealed that he had pneumonia in both lungs. Antibiotics failed to treat the pneumonia, so Ryan was transferred to Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. There, Jeannie and Ryan met with Dr. Martin Kleeman, an expert in pediatric infectious diseases. Given Ryan's severe hemophilia and reliance on factor VIII, Kleeman suspected that his pneumonia was viral rather than bacterial, hence the ineffectiveness of the antibiotic regimen. Specifically, Kleeman believed that pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or PCP, was the culprit. Alongside Kaposi sarcoma, PCP served as one of the rare opportunistic infections that alerted clinicians to the existence of a new syndrome in the early 1980s. A KS or PCP diagnosis often worked as a de facto AIDS diagnosis, particularly before the introduction of a reliable HIV antibody testing regime in the mid to late 80s. Thus, when a biopsy conducted on Ryan's lungs came back positive for PCP, it essentially confirmed that he had AIDS. The American public first encountered Ryan White in July 1985, when officials representing the Western School Corporation in Rushville, Indiana, prohibited the teenager from attending classes at Western Middle School. The decision to deny entry to Ryan might have remained a relatively minor local controversy, had it not come down just as the world was learning of actor Rock Hudson's bout with AIDS. Though Hudson had been diagnosed the previous year in 1984, news of his illness only broke in late July 1985. He thus became, as the Indianapolis Star put it, quote, the first person with international recognition to announce he has the disease. Hudson's fame made his illness noteworthy and shocking, but so too did his embodiment of normative masculinity and heterosexuality on the big screen, especially during Hollywood's so-called golden age. News of Hudson's diagnosis heightened public interest in the AIDS epidemic and stoked fears about the disease's movement beyond the established risk groups, the so-called 4 H's: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians. Just days after Ryan White was barred from attending classes at Western Middle School, the Indianapolis Star ran a front-page article next to a story about Ryan, highlighting the public's growing concerns about AIDS. Now a household word, the headline read, it's invading the straight world. Soon, Rushville, Kokomo, and the small communities surrounding them became the subjects of great national and international attention. And because AIDS was now, quote, a household word, Ryan White almost instantly became a household name, a widely celebrated figure with a small army backing his bid to return to school. By the fall, I don't have a picture of Reagan, damn it. Okay. By the fall of 1985, the inclusion of students with HIV or AIDS in the classroom had become a contentious national issue. Ryan White's youth and innocence indirectly forced President Ronald Reagan to address the AIDS crisis in public for just the second time, and the first time was during the same press conference. Shortly after White and his family began waging their battle against the local school corporation, reporters at a September 1985 press conference urged Reagan to discuss the controversy regarding students with AIDS. He did, yet he refused to affirm the right of children with HIV or AIDS to attend school. When asked to imagine that he had younger children and to indicate if he would, quote, send them to a school with a child who had AIDS, Reagan prevaricated. I can well understand the plight of the parents, the president proclaimed, and I'll spare you my Reagan impersonation. I also have compassion, he explained, for the child that has AIDS and doesn't know why somehow he is now an outcast and can no longer associate with his playmates and schoolmates. Reagan's comments disappointed health officials like Paul Volberding, an oncologist, and the director of the AIDS clinic at the San Francisco General Hospital. I don't think the president's remarks reflect what most experts in the field feel about that issue, Volberding argued. Most of us feel that kids with AIDS should be allowed to participate in normal activities. With little federal leadership on AIDS, debates about children with HIV and AIDS in schools would continue to rage in the courtroom, the press, and the interpersonal sphere, from Connecticut to the Bronx to Florida, where locals tormented and eventually banished the Ray triplets, who also had hemophilia. But the Ryan White case would loom the largest. Ryan and his family endured a lengthy courtroom battle that dragged on into the new year, 1986. Finally, in the spring of that year, Ryan secured the right to attend classes at Western Middle School, a development that received considerable coverage in the press and solidified Ryan's status as not only a national and global celebrity, but also the face of HIV/AIDS awareness. In the wake of his very public legal victory, Ryan and his family embarked on a national publicity tour of sorts. Ryan flew out to New York City to be interviewed on ABC's Good Morning America and to attend a benefit for the recently established American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR. Ryan served as the guest of honor at the lavish AMFAR benefit, held at the Jacob Javits Center and co-hosted by actress Elizabeth Taylor and fashion designer Calvin Klein. At the gala, a tuxedoed Ryan and his mother rubbed shoulders with Yoko Ono and New York's Mayor Ed Koch, while Andy Warhol snapped photographs of the mother-son duo like this one. By February of the following year, 1987, a month before the formation of ACT UP, Indiana's Health Commissioner Woodrow Myers Jr. could confidently assert that Ryan was, quote, the best-known AIDS victim in the United States, if not the world, and, crucially, one who posed, quote, the lowest possible political risk for elected officials seeking to address the epidemic. Myers' comments testified to Ryan's growing popularity and the power of his perceived innocence, which together would help guarantee the passage of the CARE Act following his death. Ryan White's death and funeral in April 1990 were media spectacles long foretold. As soon as White entered the national consciousness in mid-1985, his seeming proximity to death shaped his life story. White's frequent health scares, marked by lengthy stays at Riley Hospital for Children, consistently reminded the public of his vulnerability and, by extension, his innocence. As the nurse for the Western School Corporation confirmed in a 2011 oral history interview, Ryan did not attend school much because he was sick so often. Though Ryan's death had seemed imminent throughout his time in the national and international limelight, he lived far longer than anyone had anticipated, a fact that only added to his legend and broad appeal. While visiting Southern California in late March 1990, Ryan fell gravely ill for the last time. He and his mother promptly returned to Indiana, and he was subsequently hospitalized at Riley. Ryan White passed away on April 8th. His death was a major national story. In one May 1990 survey, 88% of American adults indicated that they had heard about Ryan White's demise. Even President George H.W. Bush and former President Reagan, not known for their interest in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, publicly commented on Ryan's death. Reagan, for one, penned an obituary for Ryan in the Washington Post. That obituary stressed Ryan's, quote, youthful innocence, thereby implying that others affected by the epidemic were guilty, or at the very least, less innocent. Further, Reagan declared that Ryan, quote, told us of a health crisis that has claimed too many victims, as if activists and medical professionals had not warned elected officials and the public of a mysterious new illness well before the summer of 1985, when Ryan's case garnered national and international attention. Finally, the obituary insisted that, quote, there have been too many funerals like his, even though hardly any funerals held for people with AIDS resembled the extravagant ceremony in which Ryan White would be laid to rest. That funeral was held on April 11th in what one reporter called, quote, the Gothic expanse of Second Presbyterian Church in Meridian Hills, an affluent community just north of downtown Indianapolis. It's a beautiful church. Some 1,500 mourners attended the funeral, while hundreds more, unable to secure a spot in the sanctuary, were stranded outdoors in the bitter cold and rain. Unsurprisingly, given Ryan's celebrity status, various stars and dignitaries were in attendance as well. First Lady Barbara Bush sat directly behind the White family, and Michael Jackson sat next to Jeannie White. Jackson had actually flown to Indiana on Donald Trump's private jet. Los Angeles Raiders defensive end Howie Long, singer Elton John, and talk show host Phil Donahue served as pallbearers. Elton John performed his song Skyline Pigeon during the ceremony, a framed photograph of Ryan sitting on his piano. Ryan laid in an open casket at the front of the sanctuary, his body adorned with some of the clothing and accessories he cherished and through which he channeled his rock star idols. His faded jean jacket, worn over a red t-shirt, framed his frail body, while reflective Oakley shades rested on his face. CNN carried the 45-minute ceremony live on air, and all three major broadcast networks showed footage from the service that evening. This elaborate service was a far cry from the quiet, poorly attended ceremonies held to honor many other people with AIDS. Some AIDS-related deaths were hardly marked at all. Many funeral home employees simply, quote, refused to touch the bodies of those who died of AIDS-related causes, and that quote is from the New York Times around that period. Given the profound stigma attached to the living and lifeless bodies of people with AIDS, members of an ACT UP affinity group called the Marys, taking a cue from artist and activist David Wojnarowicz, began staging what they called political funerals in the early 1990s. These ceremonies reflected the desperation and abjection of the overwhelming majority of people with AIDS. While Ryan's funeral had all the trappings of a formal memorial service and was legitimated through powerful institutions, the church, the state, the news media, the Marys' political funerals were fugitive, insurgent actions intended to indict these very institutions for ignoring or worsening the AIDS crisis. Ryan's highly publicized death and funeral also helped create the political space in which the federal government would allocate much-needed HIV/AIDS funding via the Ryan White CARE Act. As Ryan lay dying at Riley Hospital for Children, the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee dedicated the CARE Act in his honor. The committee's formal report on Senate Bill 2240, published several weeks later after Ryan's death, proclaimed that, quote, young Ryan White changed the world. With dignity, patience, and almost unvarying good cheer, the report read, Ryan, quote, introduced to people across America and across the world a face of AIDS that caring human beings could not turn their back upon. This committee report vividly illustrated the power of White's perceived innocence. While caring human beings could apparently spurn other people with AIDS, they could not in good conscience ignore Ryan. To be sure, the CARE Act was quite popular with legislators even before Ryan's name was affixed to the bill. An increasingly visible and militant AIDS movement in the late 80s and early 90s had prompted a stronger government response to the epidemic. Upon its introduction in early March 1990, before it was named for Ryan, Senate Bill 2240 boasted one sponsor and 25 co-sponsors. It secured another 6 co-sponsors in early April. But Ryan's name and image rendered the bill all but unassailable. Calling it the Ryan White CARE Act enabled lawmakers and activists to further, quote, sanitize HIV and AIDS, and that's a term that a lot of theorists and activists were using at the time, and in so doing to authorize AIDS funding without incurring the wrath of anti-gay and anti-drug forces. This is also at the height of the war on drugs. Indeed, attaching Ryan's name to the Senate bill attracted additional co-sponsors. thereby establishing a filibuster-proof majority that would keep the virulently homophobic Senator Jesse Helms at bay. By the time the bill passed a heavily Democratic Senate in May, 66 senators had co-sponsored it. Yet because Ryan was such a potent and powerful and popular symbol, the invocation of his name and image by federal lawmakers proved contentious. Everyone wanted to be on Ryan's side. For Senator Ted Kennedy and other supporters of the CARE Act, Orrin Hatch, for instance, even activists who may have privately opposed the use of what one reporter called, quote, a politically safe symbol. That meant passing the bill in Ryan's name. For Jesse Helms and others, that meant protecting white and other innocent victims from men who had sex with men, IV drug users, Hollywood elites, and even certain congresspeople. Through his characteristically cruel remarks, Helms sought to wrest control of Ryan's name and image away from Kennedy and other CARE Act proponents. Although in one sense his efforts failed, given the wide margins by which the Ryan White CARE Act passed, they also revealed the limits of the respectability politics and the politics of innocence evidenced in this context. Specifically, Helms identified White as an exceptional person with AIDS, who helped direct public attention away from stigmatized groups disproportionately affected by the epidemic. Through this and related observations, Helms reinforced the perceived symbolic and moral distance between white and other, perhaps more typical, people with AIDS, and he successfully promoted policies to further police and subjugate those in the latter category. As the Senate deliberated the proposed Ryan White CARE Act in mid-May 1990, Helms inveighed against, quote, the Hollywood and media crowd, the, quote, homosexual segment of the AIDS lobby, congresspeople, and other groups that he claimed were capitalizing on Ryan White's misfortune. For Helms, quote, the cynical exploitation of Ryan White served to mask the political movement behind such legislation. Ryan's name, Helms told his fellow senators, will be invoked over and over again by nefarious forces seeking to pass the CARE Act. The homosexual lobby of America knew the Ryan White story was too good to pass up, charged Helms. Therefore, his struggle and his death could be used to frighten the American public into believing that AIDS is waiting to happen to everyone, even if they do not engage in illegal and or immoral activity. Though, quote, little Ryan White was not an IV drug user or a promiscuous homosexual, Helms explained, he, quote, was portrayed as a typical victim, not the exception that he was. And the AIDS propaganda machine churned out the demand for special treatment and privileges for the kind of people who caused Ryan White's death. In spite of Helms's conniption, this already popular bill, now embellished with the name of the country's most celebrated person with AIDS, would easily pass both houses of Congress. But while the strategic emphasis on a politically safe and innocent symbol may have ensured the CARE Act's passage, it also limited the scope and the scale of the legislation. The bill and the rhetoric surrounding it did not address the structural causes of the AIDS epidemic, nor did it fully acknowledge the ways in which the crisis disproportionately affected certain groups. Rather, the CARE Act's focus on sympathetic victims, such as Ryan or Kimberly Bergalis, fortified prevailing anti-gay, anti-drug, and racial stigmas, which in turn contributed to the Act's funding issues and enabled the adoption or near adoption of punitive amendments during the CARE Act's 1990 passage and its 1995-96 reauthorization fight. Though Senator Helms' his proposed ban on funding for needle exchange programs and bleach did not pass in 1990, Senator Kennedy's related amendment prohibiting federal funds for only the former did. Kennedy's amendment actually reinforced an existing ban, federal ban on needle and syringe exchange programs, which had been introduced by Helms in 1988. Similar anti-drug and anti-gay exclusions would find their way into the CARE Act reauthorization bill in the mid-1990s. Efforts to criminalize behaviors that might lead, but probably will not lead, to HIV transmission began in earnest in the mid-1980s. But the Ryan White CARE Act expanded and formalized such efforts. The CARE Act represented, in the words of several scholars from whom I'm quoting, an important milestone in the development of U.S. HIV exposure laws. In order to receive federal funds under the CARE Act, states were required to establish and maintain mechanisms through which, quote, to prosecute HIV-infected individuals who knowingly exposed others to HIV. The Ryan White CARE Act and the criminalization statutes tucked within it built on tired tropes imagining gay men and sex workers as sex-crazed, indiscriminate spreaders of disease who threatened so-called innocents such as Ryan White. Despite these measures, the CARE Act was still a monumental achievement. Inspired by Ryan's name, image, life story, and death, the House and Senate passed their respective bills by decisive margins. After an expedited reconciliation process, the CARE Act was signed into law by President Bush on August 18, 1990. Although his administration reportedly opposed the, quote, narrow, disease-specific approach taken by the architects of the House bill. The final version of the bill authorized $882 million in AIDS funding for fiscal year 1991. That's about the equivalent of $2 billion in 2024 or 2025 dollars. And $4.5 billion in federal grants through 1995. That's about $11 billion or so. However, debates over funding would persist well into the 1990s, and the full effects of the provisions I just mentioned would only become apparent in the coming years. Just as Senator Helms had sought to block the passage of the CARE Act by aligning himself with a specific kind of innocence embodied by Ryan White, he did essentially the same thing during debates over the reauthorization of the CARE Act during the Clinton years. After firmly expressing his opposition to reauthorization, Helms proposed 5 amendments to the reauthorization bill in July 1995, including Senate Amendment number 1854. Building on existing needle exchange and sex education bans that had been on the books since the late 1980s, that amendment stipulated that, quote, no funds authorized to be appropriated under this act may be used to promote or encourage directly or indirectly homosexuality or intravenous drug use. This amendment passed the Senate by a vote of 54 to 45, but its explicitly anti-gay message was softened by a corresponding amendment proposed by 2 more moderate Republican senators. This toned-down amendment, which was subsequently adopted in the final version of the bill, read, and this is a doozy, none of the funds authorized under this title shall be used to fund AIDS programs or to develop materials designed to promote or encourage directly intravenous drug use or sexual activity, whether homosexual or heterosexual. By marking certain behaviors and populations as deviant, the Senate Amendment number 1854 and its watered-down companion, 1858, reflected and reinforced the AIDS epidemic's hierarchy of victimhood, to borrow Anthony Petro's phrase, and revealed the limits of the politics that had been enabled by the Ryan White story. Despite its support for certain HIV/AIDS prevention, research, and treatment measures, the Clinton administration ultimately backed the ban on federal funding for needle and syringe exchange programs, a ban legitimated in part through Ryan White's name and image. The administration's position, which ignored a significant body of research illustrating the need for and effectiveness of such programs, elicited the ire of activists and organizers. In 1998, Donna Shalala, Clinton's Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced that the benefits of such programs were undeniable. There was no question that the science was clear, she later told The Atlantic, but Clinton did not rescind the ban on federal funding. The president decided not to do it for political reasons, Shalala noted, alluding to firmly entrenched anti-drug stigmas and the stubborn belief that needle exchange programs encourage intravenous drug use. After some delays, the reauthorization of the Ryan White Care Act was finalized in 1996, the same year in which the widespread adoption of protease inhibitors and highly active antiretroviral therapy caused some commentators to prematurely declare the, quote, end of AIDS. Andrew Sullivan, for one, acknowledged in November of 1996 that, quote, many Americans, especially blacks and Latinos, will still die of AIDS-related causes, while nevertheless celebrating the fact that the epidemic had entered a new, less fatal phase. As scholar and theorist Michael Warner lamented in 1999, President Clinton's, quote, cynical opposition to needle exchange programs, quote, has been made easier by the general sense that AIDS is over. Accordingly, the president's rhetoric on HIV and AIDS became increasingly triumphalist near the end of his second term. When he reauthorized the Ryan White Care Act once again in 2000, Clinton placed the reauthorization within a linear narrative of progress on AIDS. Unsurprisingly, Ryan White and the law and program inscribed with his name sat at the heart of this narrative. When the CARE Act was originally created, we were sadly unable to do much for those who were sick, President Clinton explained, and I'll spare you my Clinton impersonation. Thankfully, much has changed. The CARE Act is now solidly about living with HIV and AIDS. Since its last reauthorization in 1996, biomedical research has brought hope and renewed optimism with the discovery of protease inhibitors and combination therapies. The CARE Act has made the promise of biomedical research a reality in the lives of people living with HIV and AIDS in every corner of this country. For the outgoing president, quote, Ryan White changed the world, and so has the program that bears his name. On one hand, the biomedical developments of the mid to late 1990s did make HIV and AIDS more manageable and less deadly for those with access to care. On the other, despite the claims made by Clinton, Sullivan, and others, these developments did little to challenge the anti-gay and anti-drug stigmas that swirled around HIV and AIDS. In fact, the rhetoric surrounding such biomedical advances, which implied what some scholars have termed the, quote, pastness of AIDS, may have actually enhanced these stigmas. With the advent of new medicines and the widespread embrace of certain forms of medical knowledge about HIV and AIDS, alongside the growing tendency to imagine HIV and AIDS as an African problem, not a Western one, there now was simply no excuse for acquiring HIV or dying from AIDS-related causes in the United States. Since the emergence of protease inhibitors, the growing availability of highly active antiretroviral therapy, and what some scholars have called the globalization of AIDS, the Ryan White story has similarly served to remind the public of the stigma and shame that once marked HIV and AIDS, but presumably no longer do. For example, a People magazine article commemorating what would have been Ryan's 50th birthday in December of 2021 noted that, quote, White became a symbol of hope during a time when fear and misconception about AIDS were prevalent in the United States. But old misconceptions persist, and they've been joined by newer ones, including the notion that HIV and AIDS is somehow over or mostly over. Just as the Ryan White story has often sharpened the lines between those who supposedly deserved HIV or AIDS and those who did not, narratives that relegate HIV and AIDS to the past or to Africa obscure the fact that some populations in the U.S. remain particularly susceptible to illness, infection, and death. It is no accident that the burdens of HIV and AIDS over 35 years after Ryan's death and the passage of the Ryan White Care Act continue to be borne by the most stigmatized populations in the United States: people who use intravenous drugs, queer and trans people, those without health insurance, Black, brown, and indigenous people, and people with disabilities. It is also no accident that similar processes have unfolded within the COVID-19 pandemic and the Mpox epidemic. While "we're all in this together" became a rallying cry during the early phases of the coronavirus pandemic, its tolls were and remain unevenly distributed. Further, Mpox has recirculated well-worn tropes positioning queer people as vectors of disease. Notions of innocence and guilt, immunity and vulnerability, inflected by race, class, gender, and sexuality, have defined each of these crises. The Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, an outgrowth of the Ryan White Care Act, has saved and improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people with HIV and AIDS. As of December 2024, about 576,000 people were receiving medical care or other support services through the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. Some 90.6% of Ryan White clients at the time were virally suppressed, meaning they could live longer, fuller lives, and they could not transmit the virus. The federal legislation passed and programming implemented in Ryan's name have gone a long way toward making the HIV/AIDS epidemic less lethal. But challenges persist, and the new administration will present new, more intense challenges for people living with HIV and AIDS. Although the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program provides care and support to over 500,000 people, that figure represents only half of all individuals living with HIV and AIDS in the United States. Some of these individuals do not qualify for care, a sign of our nation's patchwork and uneven healthcare system, but many others who may qualify for care simply do not receive it, either because they do not seek it out, or they don't know about these resources, or because they're unaware of their status. In the latter case, the lingering stigmas attached to HIV and AIDS continue to discourage people from getting tested. Further, the second Trump administration has mounted a formidable attack on HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment programs at home and abroad, part of a broader assault on particular forms of medical research and knowledge. If we hope to continue curbing the HIV/AIDS epidemic, if we hope to continue saving the lives of some of the most vulnerable members of our society, and if we hope to continue writing the best parts of Ryan White's story, these developments must be challenged loudly, unceasingly, and unapologetically. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Is this on?
You can stay here, but yes.
Okay. It's not on.
It's not. There, no, it is.
Hope I didn't talk too long.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Fascinating. And one of the things I love about your work, both this book and your first book, is how you have taken events that were in the headlines and yet actually unpacked them and showed them in their full complexity beyond just people who might be reading those headlines. It's really impressive. I highly encourage you to get this book. Quick note, we here at CPH actually spend a lot of time near this topic. We have a very large oral history program on the PEPFAR program, President Bush's initiative in Africa and elsewhere to try to confront the AIDS epidemic on that continent. And expect to hear more about that in the coming months and years, because the project is getting into its next phase, which is no longer collection, but now dissemination. So what we'd like to do now is give opportunity for people if they have any questions. As always, we have a couple of microphones. We'd like you to raise your hand and we'll give you the mic. And as always, wait, if you would, for the microphone to get to you so that we can record you on the video recording.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. Just a general question.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the media helped his case or hurt his case more? And what could they have done better?
In terms of his desire to go back to school, or in what respect?
Well, I'll let you decide.
Okay, I think they were somewhat unfair, not only to Ryan and his family, but I think also to people in the area. And that's not to, excuse what happened there. I have a chapter about how there was this tendency to kind of imagine the folks in Kokomo and Rougeaville all as sort of uneducated, as uniformly opposed to Ryan, which was not the case. There was a really vocal minority that sought to prevent him from going to school. But there was an interesting kind of regional dynamic where people were saying, okay, this would never happen in, other parts of the country. It's Indiana or, the flyover states. And that's just not really true. I mean, their response was actually pretty consistent with how people across the country felt about HIV and AIDS. There was a lot of confusion, misunderstanding. I think the visibility of the case helped in terms of getting him back to school. I don't know, he didn't want that attention at all, and the family didn't want the attention at all, and in fact, it was pretty overwhelming for them. So in that respect, it's probably not, so he often said, it's cool to hang out with Michael Jackson, but if I could not do that, I would not do that. If I could just not be sick, I would much rather do that. Yeah, of course. Great question. Thank you. Yeah. You go for it. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk. Really interesting subject. I'm curious about the fact that Ryan contracted HIV/AIDS after using Factor VIII, which was at the time a really exciting, groundbreaking scientific and biomedical achievement. So I'm curious if the fact that he contracted HIV/AIDS after using this new and exciting biomedical advancement, if that led to kind of an overhaul or look into Factor VIII. And I'm thinking now, I've donated blood many times in my life, and we have to answer super long questionnaires right now that make sure that you don't have any kind of risk factors that the FDA would assume to be a risk factor. Did that lead to some of this, or how, if your research illuminated any paths between those two?
Yeah, so this led directly to the heat treatment of the blood supply, and also to those restrictions against people who have had sex with men who have had sex with men. So those restrictions were on the books for quite some time. They've recently been loosened, but not fully, right? So that there's a direct line there. Yeah. Was there another part of your question there? No, okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
As you rightly pointed out, there still is a stigma attached to AIDS. But are your students, the younger people, undergrads, or maybe the grad students who read this book last week, are they amazed by the amount of horrible things that they did to Ryan back in 1990?
I might ask the grad students who are here, if you don't mind telling us. So I had the great pleasure of speaking with some of them yesterday during the class. Come on.
Oh, we got one.
I mean, just based on the things that we read in class for other subjects, I wasn't really that surprised. And growing up in the world that I currently do, it's not shocking, but it makes me very sad.
Yeah, and I will note that the grad students, nothing against them, but they didn't know who Ryan White was, and none of my undergraduate students really know who he is. For me, this was a formative story. This is how I learned about HIV and AIDS. I talk a lot in the book about this kind of pedagogy that he didn't necessarily spearhead, but he was used to teach people about AIDS. And generally that lesson was focused on being kind to people with AIDS rather than preventing AIDS or to recognize that everybody in a way could be susceptible. So it's a very interesting kind of narrow understanding of AIDS education. But no, people don't really know about him today. People do, but my students have no idea. And I taught a class about AIDS in the fall of '24, and those students, again, not their fault, but they knew very little about HIV and AIDS, and it was difficult to kind of disrupt the idea that it was over. That was kind of the thesis of the class, but they still had this stubborn belief that, back then, it was, of course, it was a more intense epidemic, but it's still an epidemic, and not just in other places. I mean, in the United States, in the Deep South where I live, it's a huge epidemic. Yeah, thank you so much for your question.
My understanding of the research funds that were put into, that derived from the Ryan White Care Act, both initially and then in '95, is that a remarkable amount of it actually went for what we might term basic science research.
Yep.
In fact, my understanding, you may not know this, but I'm not a medical doctor.
Neither am I. I'm not the useful kind of doctor.
I didn't say I wasn't useful. Is if you are receiving cancer treatment today, you are benefiting directly from the primary work that was done on AIDS in the 1990s. So if you survive cancer today, you actually have this stigmatized disease in some ways to thank.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that in our own day, but also related to that, how you found yourself thinking about this book perhaps differently as you wrote parts of it during our own pandemic.
Yeah. So I actually started writing this book before COVID-19 hit, and I was just kind of struck by, it's nothing new. This is kind of the history of medicine, the history of epidemics. These sorts of patterns repeat, and I kind of alluded to them at the end of the talk. But it's just a way to kind of reinforce, not a way, but this is, hierarchies are reinforced through this sort of mechanism, right? And so, as I mentioned, it's no accident that the tolls of these epidemics are so unevenly distributed. So people who are medical doctors will use terms like the social determinants of health, which I think is very insightful, rather than I think the general understanding of epidemics as kind of the great equalizer. We had this conversation yesterday about how you and I had the ability to stay at home during the real height of the pandemic. And a lot of people did not have that. They had to go to work, right? I was working, right? But not in a retail job or a service sector job. So, yeah, great question.
Thank you so much. I haven't had an opportunity to read this book, but I've read your first book. And I'm interested, I'm interested because in the picture even there of the role of parenthood and how I definitely see that as kind of a through line from your first book. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how your perspective on that changed, if at all. And then secondly, I wondered if after Ryan's death, if his family remained in this advocacy or if it was something that kind of they went out of the spotlight after the end of his life.
Yeah, so I guess with respect to the first question, what element of parenthood are you kind of interested in hearing about?
I think the role of parents in the media and the way that propels a story from being kind of a local story to something much bigger.
Yeah.
And obviously in Stranger Danger, it became a much more panic, not that there wasn't panic here, but
Right.
I'm kind of interested in that relationship between the media and parents with kids who something terrible has happened.
Right. So I think in Stranger Danger, it is the parents of missing and murdered children who are kind of driving this moral panic and who are often very visible features of the panic, right? Where they're oftentimes kind of kicking around really exaggerated statistics and they have this kind of emotional resonance it has an appeal because of their status as bereaved parents. In this case, you didn't have as many kind of public-facing parents. Jeannie was the exception. I mean, you had individuals who were vehemently opposed to Ryan going back to school, but they weren't household names like Jeannie White or Ryan White. And Jeannie was very reluctant to be in the spotlight. In fact, she got a lot of hate from a lot of people from the community who thought that she was kind of propelling this story. But if you know anything about her, I mean, she's very soft-spoken. She does not like this sort of attention. However, to answer your second question, and I talk about this in the book, she has been very instrumental in AIDS advocacy, and just recently published a piece in the South Bend Tribune, I think, about HIV criminalization statutes. So she's very much kind of on the cutting edge of this and really understands the epidemic in a way that none of us could, right? Yeah, thank you.
Were there other young people or children that could have been the other Ryan White or? Yeah.
So there was a pretty well-known case in Florida, the Ray triplets. I don't know if has anyone ever heard of the Ray triplets? They're kind of the most famous case apart from Ryan White, and they were banished from their town. There are questions about whether their home was burned by arson, but is likely what happened, I think, from what I understand. I haven't done too much research on that case. And there were other cases in Massachusetts, and that was kind of, I think it's Swansea, Massachusetts, and this child was kind of embraced at in the school, and so that's often kind of used as the counterexample to say, you know, there is a way in which to incorporate children and not make them feel children with HIV or AIDS and not make them feel, you know, like outcasts. The Bronx was also so that was an anonymous case. People did not know who the child was, but there was a child with HIV and AIDS, and there was a huge uproar there as well about this child going to school, but the child was never named, as far as I know. Great question, thank you.
One more question over here. Oh, or maybe two more questions over there.
I would just like to acknowledge and thank you for your presentation. I want to let everyone know here that has attended today that the Ryan White Fund is alive and well in Dallas today, and I work with it every day. I also work on the grant writing for this, and in Dallas County in particular, we are the second largest county right now of new diagnosis for HIV, especially for individuals aged 13 to 24. And again, with this, we're able to provide very, very positive outcomes for people that are living with or impacted by HIV, including their families, including children. So I really appreciate you educating us, keeping this alive, and it is making a huge difference for hundreds and thousands of people in Dallas today.
Thank you for your work, really appreciate it.
One last question over here, Cam.
Thanks for the great talk. I was interested when you mentioned a couple of times the sort of international reception of this story, and I was just wondering and curious if in your research you found any sort of transnational elements to this, the formation of these respectability politics around this, or conversely some of the activist networks that look to challenge it.
Right, yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know of much kind of in terms of transnational circuits when it comes to this sort of thing, but there are other Ryan Whites in other countries that people have told me about. And I don't know their names, but I know there's one in South Africa. It's kind of a household name, and I think somewhere else in Europe. So this is a familiar story that has kind of played out in other places, but I don't know of any kind of transnational connections. Thank you, though.
Well, I want to thank you, but before I do my formal thanks, I need to do one more bit of education for our students, especially because this picture is here. Ryan White and I are exactly contemporaries in age. I want all the students to appreciate just how cool those shoes are. I mean, I would have killed for those, let me tell you.
Converse, right?
Yeah.
Converse,
yeah. That was hip.
He was cool. He was a cool kid.
Yeah, he had a contract. In any event, this was wonderful. Thank you. I feel like we learned a lot. I feel like I learned everything. Every time I read one of your books, I'm just so enthused to tell people about the amazing thing I didn't know. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
And thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.